Hello students, today we are going to be discussing the Progressive Era, which in your textbook is Chapter 8, and we're going to be covering roughly the years 1890 to 1920. The Progressive Era was basically fueled by a perceived need to reform wrongs and problems that were happening in society. And the reason for this is that industrialization, urbanization, and immigration brought new challenges to America. Now, progressives believed that with new ideas and the workings of an honest, efficient government, they could bring about social justice, again, solving the problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Now, what made a person progressive was not the political party that they were a member of, not their religion, and not their ethnicity. What made someone a progressive was the ideas that they had, the ideas they shared. Progressives believed that industrialization and urbanization had created problems, and they wanted to create reforms to fix these problems. Now, more specifically, they wanted state and federal laws. They wanted to apply logic and reason to solve these problems. And there is a faction of the progressives that wanted to apply religion to solve these problems. Now, the progressive movement was similar to the populist movement, going on around the same time period. The difference being the progressive movement was involved more middle class people, and the populist movement was made up more of farmers and workers. So what were some of these problems the progressives wanted to fix? Well, a large portion of it was political reform. A large portion of it was women's rights, most specifically the right to vote, and then also creating a more honest government. They wanted to stamp out things like political machines, which were corrupt political organizations that used illegal and unethical tactics to get what they wanted done, more specifically in city governments. And they would even sometimes help people solve their personal problems in order to maintain loyalty and perpetuate the political machine. Also wanted to help urban conditions. They wanted to fix the problems that big business had created. They said the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was inadequate. And as far as urban conditions, they wanted to get more paved streets, safer drinking water, and decent housing. They also wanted to fight poverty. They wanted better conditions for the urban poor and also the miners and the factory workers. And they wanted laws to protect children. Now, this was all happening during what was known as, a portion of this was happening during the Gilded Age, in which America looked great from the outside, but inside, if you look deeper, there was a lot of problems. There was a group of journalists that wanted to make these problems known and make them more widely viewed by the public, and they were known as the muckrakers. They were socially conscious journalists of the early 1900s. They were given this derogatory term from Teddy Roosevelt. He likened them to a muckrake, which was a tool used to clean animal stables. They would rake out the muck, or combination of manure, dirt, and straw from the stable out into the center of the barn where it could be seen by everyone and cleaned out. He said this is what the muckrakers were doing by bringing out the problems of society. We're going to go through a list now of some famous muckrakers, the first being Lincoln Steffens. He managed McClure's magazine. He published The Shame of Cities. This was a book that exposed political corruption. That was his main focus. The main focus of Jacob Riis was exposing the conditions of the urban poor. In your textbook, we'll read a section of his book, How the Other Half Lives, on page 215. He was also a photographer for the New York Evening Sun. Ida Tarbell had a vendetta against John D. Rockefeller. Her father had lost his job after John D. Rockefeller had purchased the refinery at which he worked, and as a result, her father became an alcoholic, and she had a very, very rough, poverty-stricken childhood. This fueled her need to bring down John D. Rockefeller, and she later wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil, in which she highlighted all the perceived wrongdoings of John D. Rockefeller and his oil company. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. It exposed the harsh conditions of immigrant workers. That was his goal. However, the public took away from it the unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry. The jungle was set in, the setting was a meatpacking industry. Upton Sinclair later said of his book, "I aimed at the public's heart and I hit it in the stomach." What the public took away from this was the fact that the meatpacking industry needed to be cleaned up and reforms were needed to make sure their meat and other food products were safe to consume. The social gospel is part of the religious faction of the progressives. They said by following the Bible's teachings about charity and justice, we can fix our problems. There were also things that institutions that popped up across the country called settlement houses. They were community centers that provided social services. They would basically teach immigrants and other urban poor classes in things like child care, and they would provide nursery schools and kindergartens for the working parents. The leading figure in this movement was Jane Addams, who started the most famous settlement house, which was Hull House in Chicago. Now, we mentioned before one of the problems that they wanted to tackle was child labor. In 1916, progressives got passed the Keating-Owens Child Labor Act, which effectively banned child labor. John Dewey was also prominent during this time as the father of the modern American high school. He wanted schools to teach more technical skills such as shop, home ec, and etc. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire occurred in March of 1911. It killed 146 workers, mostly women. A main reason for this is that many of the workers were literally chained to their machines. This was done to the goal of the owners of the factory was to use this to make the workers more productive. This is an example of the types of conditions that were going on in factories at this time that the progressives were trying to fight. And this, of course, sparked a push for industry reform. Moving on to government reform, we're going to start with city government reforms. In 1900, a hurricane devastated Galveston, Texas, and this had an unintended consequence because as Galveston, Texas was rebuilding, they replaced their mayor with a 5-person commission. They found that this worked better than the previous system, and by 1918, there were approximately 500 cities across the United States that had adopted what had become known as the Galveston Plan. A little bit of local history here. Dayton, Ohio was one such city. And this concludes the first section of our flipped video.